Hello, welcome to Authors at Your Library. I'm Michael Stamacher, Director of the Barr Memorial Library at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Tonight, we're pleased to have Gary Grossman and Ed Fuller with us. They are the authors of the new thriller, Red Deception. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Great to be here.
Thank you. So, first of all, I'd like you each in turn to tell us a little bit about yourselves. If we could start with Mr. Fuller.
Okay. Excuse me, very quickly, raised in Boston area in a town called Attleboro, and went through school there, went to Boston University, seemed to like that first name, and finished up, joined the Army because in those days, if I didn't, they would join me through the draft. And I served as an officer because I'd gone through ROTC. And I did 2 years in Germany, 1 year in Vietnam, and came back and looked for a job when there were none. Luckily, I joined a company called Marriott and realized that I was not made for the in-flight division, which takes care of food at that time for aircraft. Luckily, they sold that long before problems set into the airline industry, and they noticed that, and because of my military background, they put me into hotel sales. We had 12 hotels, and today Marriott has 7,200. And so my career kind of marched through 40 years, but the last 22, I ran the international division. I had been head of marketing and sales for 4 years earlier, so I had already traveled internationally a great deal. But clearly, that was a transition for me. The experiences were unbelievable, and you're reading about several of them when you're reading the book. Gary and I can lift them up and move them anywhere in the world we want. I love novels. You don't have to be that accurate. And I retired in 12, came back to California. It's not New England, it's warm, but had a great time and started working with Gary. And he'll probably tell that story because he loves to get that in after he talks about himself. And I've been doing a number of consulting jobs out here until the toward the end of 2019.
Mr. Grossman.
Well, thank you, Gary. Please, Ed is the real deal, and I will be talking about that when he says you don't have to be accurate. Actually, there's so much in Red Hotel, the first book in the series, and Red Deception, that is accurate because it's based on Ed's experiences, and we'll get to that. So it's the books are rich with history and imagination as well, and that's how I come at it. I'm a thriller writer. I have been for well since 9/11. I was in New York on 9/11 and was having, as a TV producer, pitching to the History Channel. And someone at the History Channel said, "Do you think we're running out of history?" That was September 10th, the day before 9/11. And as a documentary filmmaker, mostly for the various TV channels and NBC News and Discovery and National Geographic and the History Channel and A&E and on and on and on, I was really interested in um, areas that my parents had brought me to. My dad was in law enforcement, Army veteran. My mother was in politics, and getting into political thrillers just seemed like a natural. And to Ed's point on how we kind of got together, there's a James Bond side to this story, which I love telling the story, and that's why Ed wanted to tee me up for it. I was walking our dog asleep down beside me right now one evening, bumped into our neighbor, not a couple of blocks away, and he said, "Oh, Gary, I'm so glad I saw you tonight. I want you to hook up with a guy named Ed Fuller. He's interested in having a collaborator for a novel. I said, well, I've never collaborated with people on novels before, but tell me about him. And he did. And I thought, what an incredible background. Former president of Marriott International. But what do I have in common with him to be able to work on a novel together? And Bruce said, you know what I do. He's on a board with me at BU, but you know what my career is about. And I said, yeah. And he said, trust me, meet him. Well, Bruce Fairstein wrote the first three Pierce Brosnan James Bond movies. So, and he was walking his dog named Shadow. So come on, I met Ed. It maybe took me 30 seconds to realize Ed was as much in the anti-terrorism business as well as the hotel business, getting teams and guests safely out of Cairo at the fall of Mubarak and out of Tripoli when Gaddafi fell, and dealing with bombings in hotels, preventing them, and also learning from them. And the stories that he began telling me, and the contacts and the relationships that he had with the FBI and with the Army and with members of Foreign Service, as well as the State Department in the United States and other countries, and the CIA, which of course I found very interesting. Um, I said, yes, I think we can work together. And we have, and we've created a character named Dan Riley that is basically based on a lot of Ed Fuller's experiences.
Well, that's fascinating, and I hope you're going to bear with me because I want to back into talking about the book Red Deception, but I want to back into the whole idea of the series of books, taking ripping a page, no pun intended, from you, Gary, to talk a little bit more about Ed. I want to put Ed a little bit on the spot here. So, Ed, he's talked about how you all came together and how you all decided you found that you all were able to work together. When you were wanting to work together and looking for a collaborator, what were you looking for at that point?
That's a that's an exceptionally good question. I had written a business book and had done my own business book. Thank you, Gary. We don't always get this question, but we're prepared when we need it. And the business book, I wrote it actually, but had a heavy hand of Wiley, the editor from Wiley, really helping me put the right touches on it and make it go. Luckily, it had a great title. You can't lead with your feet on the desk, and people loved that. And it was very popular. It was actually printed by Wiley then in Japan and China. So it got a great deal of read around the world. And so I said one day, yeah, I've, I've, I've got to do something. I've got an itch. I'm now retired. I don't want to sit here and twiddle my thumbs. I need to write a book. So I sat down and I started my first book. I wrote, the fire was crackling, it was cold outside, and and they made love. Okay, next book, chapter. They were down on the beach. The palm trees were waving, and they made love. So third chapter, I'm going. I'm tired, uh, and so I said, we've got to do something else here. Well, Bruce has been a good friend for a long time, and I told him the story one day after one of our trustee meetings, and he looked at me and said, I think I have a solution. But that's all you have to ask, Bruce. You don't want to know how, when, or where. And Gary was that solution because I had stories and I can tell stories, but I couldn't glue the characters together. And I came from hospitality, and Gary is a chef, very good executive chef. And he blends that story for me. And together, I've learned from him and that I can drag out some points that are pretty exciting that we may not have thought about. But together, it's truly a collaboration. We live 35, 40 miles apart, but we try to see each other as much as we can because, as we were talking earlier, um, you've got to be with people at some point.
I want to come back to the geographic span, but I want to point out, I can hear as you describe it, Mr. Fuller, I hear
It's
there's oh Ed, I hear there is the work that you did for Marriott and the logistics and the thinking and all of that and all the management that had to go together. And I can see that coming to get out for the books. I can see your international experience coming out, both as an author and as working as the head of international. And then I see Gary and his documentary work and very visual, very much telling a story visually. And so, Gary, tell me how you take those pieces and turn it into, for lack of a better word, a cinematic recipe.
Well, I'll go back to just the joy of working with Ed. Imagine you're at a dinner party and you find yourself sitting next to the most interesting person in the world based on what his experience is. I write from the comfort of my computer. I'll do a lot of internet research. I have, generally speaking, experts and people I can turn to in terms of accuracy for weaponry and people in the White House and people in law enforcement that I can turn to. And I imagine and I create stories. And if you start thinking, you come up with the unthinkable. And then the unthinkable could be pretty experiential ultimately, especially when you work with somebody like Ed who experienced it. So the great thing is I didn't have to make up scenarios. He was there in the middle of scenarios. A bombing that Ed can tell you about in Jakarta that affected obviously two of his hotels, Ritz and a Marriott, but the bomb was brought in by one of the florists who were working in the hotel and trusted. And then he took me through that whole story. And that's what actually the story of that bombing is what begins Red Hotel, the first book in the series so far. And that story also kind of pays off at the end of the book. So the richness of what Ed describes gives me the active verbs and the adjectives and the color and it's not as if I'm taking dictation. He's telling me stories. Normally, when I do interviews for TV, or always I'm shooting video. Back to my radio days, obviously recording audio. When I work with Ed, I don't record it because I'm writing everything down, and that kind of goes back to I think going to high school and elementary school. There's something magical. Magical is not the right word, but there's something remarkable that when you're writing something, it goes from your hand to your head. You remember where it is on the paper. You remember, and I'm able to look at it, and I'm writing furiously, and it will be there. And if I ever have to follow up on him with him, which we do, I can ask him a follow-up question. Often, when you're recording somebody, you might not be tuned in, and I find honestly, and it will probably happen today too. Virtually every interview we do, I end up, here's one from one of the last ones. I end up writing notes while Ed's talking in the interview because I'm hearing another story. So I love your question. It's a perfect blend. And Ed is the real deal. He's the source with so many stories yet to go. And a lot of them, even in You Can't Lead with Your Feet on the Desk, which is his philosophy. His philosophy is you've got to get out there in the field and you have to understand the culture over the strategy, as I heard General David Griffith talk about yesterday in a Zoom conversation I was in.
So I want to start with Red Hotel, and I'd like you all to tell me about the process we've talked a little bit about how you kind of interrelate, but tell me about the process of writing that first book together and how it worked.
Well, we worked to put together, most people would call an outline from my business school training, a fishbone. And we really put key stories in at that point. Now, we always come up with an ending, but we never use it. But it's there to make me feel good because got to guide something. And obviously, we need something like the Indonesian hotel blowing up in Tokyo to get things started. And in the case of Red Deception, I don't want to give away too much, but you will see it when you show the folks the trailer. But some explosive activity right up in front. The key, though, is once we have that, we start putting different stories in, and then Gary gets his paintbrush, or if he's in his chef mode, gets out the bouillabaisse and the chicken broth and starts in, and then we talk about it, and we talk about it, and we talk about it. And if we didn't talk about it, we'd be in trouble. And then maybe one of us says, we need more action here. We need more action there. We go back and we may rewrite it. Or in trying to come up with twists and turns, we focus on trying to create one. And in uh, this book, we created one, well, Red Deception. We created one that didn't exist until we started telling a story about when I crashed in Colombia in a plane during a review of a market. And we just moved that entire crash over to Venezuela and then started down another route right there. So we've got the fishbone. Gary?
Yeah, and Ed can mention just a nugget of something, and then I'll do some more research, and it becomes a thread that we just kind of interlace in the novel, in the thriller. It really becomes a living, breathing um, uh, uh, process for us, um, because there's so much of what we write that then we need to plant a seed earlier in the book. And then if we do that, then it might have two or three places where it's going to be growing a little bit more. And something that we hadn't even thought of in the outline becomes tremendously important by the time we're finished. Um, and and it could just be a sentence that Ed has, or a whole story that weaves in. And there's as you look at as you read Red Hotel and Red Deception, and I'll share what our editor has even gone through. Our editor will say, "Not so sure, is this believable?" And I said, "Call Ed, talk to Ed. It's what happened." Really, trying to get people out of harm's way with militia and terrorists, and a bus driver loses his keys and then can't take out 70 people on a bus and get them to the hotel. I said, yeah, talk to Ed. Talk to Ed when we came to what we call sexpionage, used by the Russians, not invented by the Russians, used by every government and every regime probably since the dawn of time. One of the editors said, people still do that? Yeah, people still do that. And if you want to talk to Ed about how much is recorded and heard and overheard in hotels in Moscow or in Beijing, give Ed a call, talk to him.
So, Ed, give us give us your give away what you want to give away about Red Deception. Tell us what you want us to know. Just tease us about that. We've talked around the book a whole lot at this point, but we haven't really talked about what it is.
Well, I want people to buy it and hold it in their hand to really get the feel of it. Now we're going to have audio, and we've got obviously other venues, but the book in hand, I think I had a friend reading it the other day, and I was at their house, and they're going like this and going, I just can't stop. So that's what I want to see. And that's what Gary has been able to help in creating through his own strengths and ability. So now I'll answer your question after I got the advertisement through. the the fact is that there are numerous stories in there. One of them is the plane crash. And so when you follow that, you have to go back and say, Ed, what happened in the plane crash? You'll find in there a story about, well, what's interesting is you'll find a story about sex espionage. And we won't tell you where or when, but in fact, that we've got CIA documents that are declassified that discuss uh, totally the program. And when I was in Berlin in the 70s, I had to stay in East Berlin because there were no rooms in West Berlin. And every morning I had to go through Checkpoint Charlie. And I was there with a lot of other executives from companies that worked with me on a reservation network. The hotel we stayed in had been built by the Swedes, a beautiful hotel by any standard in the middle of East Berlin. No East Berliners could stay, or Eastern Berlin or Eastern Germany could stay in that hotel. They had one restaurant they could use. This was a trap to get money for East Germany that was hard currency because they were dying for hard currency. Well, I've just got to say, and wife isn't here now, but she wouldn't take umbrage because we weren't married then, that there were these young ladies serving in the bar that could have all won the Miss America contest and the Miss Universe contest. And of course, I was noticing them. And one of my friends, French from Concord Hotel, says, don't even think about it. Those ladies are on the payroll of the Stasi. And number two, they have cameras in your room. And just don't think about it. Well, later, I had a conversation with one of our Mexican owners who had just come back from Cuba. And he basically told the story of their negotiation for the for cement. And he said at the end of the meeting, which was a major accomplishment for the Mexicans, they were going to meet and have signing ceremony. And so the night before, they were all given opportunities, and young ladies, and the evening went on. Next morning, let's sign the deal. And they said, ah, and they pushed a brown envelope over to the Mexicans. And they opened the brown envelope, and there was no doubt about it. The camera had been working extremely well in each of their rooms. And the Mexicans said, don't even try that on us. We come from Mexico. You could have confused an American, but don't even try this. We've been around. And so they signed the deal. But clearly they were going to try to change the deal that morning. And I've got maybe 3 or 4 more stories for you, but I'll have to meet you at the bar outside Fort Knox.
And Michael, all of that's interwoven in Red Deception, not all, some, and these stories yet to come in the next book, Red Chaos. Um, with Red Deception, it's about our infrastructure. Really, really timely. It begins with an attack on the 14th Street Bridge in Washington. It was there when the airplane went down a number of years ago. So we're recalling what that experience was like. But there's an explosion there. There's an attack on the Lincoln Tunnel. All of these almost simultaneous. There's an attack on the Stan Musial Bridge along the water, along the Mississippi in St. Louis. Short while later, Pittsburgh, city with so many bridges. And then ultimately, a target is the Hoover Dam. Now, our infrastructure, as we know in reading the headlines every day, we're woefully inadequate. America gets, I think, a C minus in its infrastructure right now. We've known that for 50 years. We've needed to do things. Well, if we know it, guess who else knows it? The bad guys. And the bad guys in our world are really manipulated by a man named Nikolai Gorshkov. He is, for all intents and purposes, um, Vladimir Putin. He's our stand-in for Vladimir Putin. And what does Putin want? Well, the same thing that our character wants. He wants to rebuild the Eastern Bloc nations that he had during the Cold War. Why? Because he can have the breadbasket, he can have their natural resources, he can control, he gets money in for his expeditions, and one country after another, he's interested in having them fall, just as Putin. That's been his dream since the end of the Cold War, since the Berlin Wall fell. And he blames the Kremlin for letting that happen. So our guy, Gorshkov, really has the same dream. So you pit that against the manner in which he can sow unrest and have deception, create deception, and attack America's infrastructure. It's all basically about taking our eyes off the prize. And it's not so easy for us to do because we're always looking at the next shiny object, as we know. So there's the capsule of what the book is, again, interlaced with Ed's real life stories. So it's very, very rich in the real world and likewise in Ed's world. And I go back to 9/11, who were among the first people called into Washington, to the NSA, and to the Pentagon, to the CIA, the FBI, to talk about where are we at risk that we're not thinking about. They are people like and including Bruce Fierstein, who wrote the Pierce Brosnan James Bond movies, and other thriller writers who were thinking beyond what maybe the Beltway is thinking. Tom Clancy would have been there, I'm sure, if he were still alive. I think he had been dead by 2001. But the people who are writing what seems to be an imaginative is really quite real in the minds of those who want to do us harm.
So, do you want to give us a preview of the third book, where you're going to go with this?
Ed, do we, Gary, want to talk about that?
I think we could do a little bit. I think that, again, continuing where Putin is and our character Gorshkov, we know what's happening with global warming, with the Arctic ice melting, and the northern sea route becoming more and more accessible. Russia holding, I think it's 9 nuclear-powered icebreakers. And we have 2, and one of them's in dry dock, and the other one's down, I think, in Antarctica. What would it mean for that sea route to be so open, and what would it mean for Russia's ability to sell oil around the globe? And that's what Dan Riley, our main character, kind of finds himself in the middle of. Is that too much, Ed?
Not too much, but the excitement is our friend Gorbachev. Almost got the wrong president there. Putin, I like to use. It's much easier for me.
Our publisher made us change it. In fact, it was Putin in the first draft of the first book, and they said,
"Yes, we use real names on the first book to get comfortable with." So he is smarter than the average bad guy, and he has successfully in the second book kept the nationality of the Russians involved, not involved. He used other nations. And so he is continuing to figure out how he can go up in front of a microphone and say, we didn't do anything with this. We didn't hack your country. We didn't take things like that, and still do it, which he is doing again in the third book in spades. And he has a strategy that not only touches Gary's area, but touches a lot of the part of the world that haven't been playing in. And so we take you on a little more of a round with the world trip.
Well, that sounds like a great place to leave it. Gary Grossman, Ed Fuller, thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Pleasure was ours.
We appreciate it and we wish you well. We've been talking with Gary Grossman and Ed Fuller, authors of the Red Hotel series, with the newest installment, Red Deception, and Red Chaos to come. Thanks for listening.